Hey everyone, welcome to day two of remote learning for American History 1. My name is Mr. Thorpe. If you don't know who I am an American History 1 teacher, obviously, and also I teach AP Psych as well. But me, Miss Budzinski, Mr. Black, who are the three American 1 teachers in the spring, are going to be rotating videos throughout this process. And handling it kind of together as a team instead of individually. So you'll see me if you don't know who I am already. If you do know who I am or I'm your teacher, I guess it's good to kind of see you again virtually. But anyway, I'm handling this second day of stuff, which is basically from James Madison up through James Monroe and the Compromise of 1820 or the Missouri Compromise. So we're going to get right into it. I want to go as quickly and hopefully painlessly as possible. So, anyways, we're going to start here with James Madison, who was Thomas Jefferson's right-hand man during his presidency. He was Secretary of State. He had served in Congress. He was very well qualified. Uh, Also, if you remember from the Constitutional Convention, he was the kind of came to be known as the father of the Constitution because of his journals, which allowed us to, kind of have an inside view of what happened because there were no official notes kept. So he was very important in that regard. But he was very well qualified to be president, and he continued. He was the second in the line of four consecutive Democratic Republican presidents. If you see here, um, he continued Jefferson's tradition of wanting kind of a limited national government, um, and he was the second in like I said, the four in a row of Democratic Republican presidents. So anyway, but the big thing about him is that he inherited a couple of things that carried over from Jefferson's presidency, and one of them was some problems abroad with France and England um, having their problems carrying over into America's problems. And uh, France and Britain had been fighting really what seems like forever, but it really kind of continued from the French Revolution on. And they were what they were doing was they were trying to keep the other one from trading with the United States, and that, as a result, hurt the United States' free trade interests in Europe. And there were a couple of other things we'll get into in just a minute that kind of snowballed into the War of 1812. But because of this kind of denial of free trade rights, combined with uh, what was called impressing sailors, which isn't impressing like, oh, that's cool, that's awesome. Not that kind of impressing. It's more the what British Navy would do is they would stop French ships or ships they believed to be allies of France, and they would then force those sailors to become. They would accuse them of being deserters from the British Navy, and then force them to be or to serve for the British Navy from that point forward. So they were really taking them prisoner and forcing them to be British naval officers. And this happened a couple of times with American citizens who were not deserters, obviously, of the British Navy. But because of that, um, that really was a very big cause to the War of 1812. And then also one other thing that's not on here is there. I'll just do this very quickly because I don't want to spend a ton of time on it. But there were a lot of problems in the frontier region as the United States moved westward. There were a lot of problems between, as you can imagine, Native Americans who were present in that area of territory in the United States and these settlers moving west. And a lot of those Native Americans had pre-existing relationships with British soldiers who were present in Canada and in the Northwest, the Ohio River Valley, and things like that. And as these conflicts became more and more frequent, and the blame went to the British, it again was another big cause of the War of 1812 breaking out. So free trade, impressing of sailors, and then also problems in the frontier um, were the biggest reasons why the War of 1812 broke out. So in June of 1814, uh, James Madison calls a session of Congress to discuss these problems with Britain, and two sides kind of formed during this session of Congress. There's the anti-war Federalists, mostly Northerners, mostly those that didn't want to go to war. Um, and then there were also a group called the War Hawks, was kind of what they came to be known as, and they were led by Henry Clay and a couple of other Southern Republicans who really felt like because our rights were being violated, because our free trade enterprise was being denied, they felt like it was necessary for us to go to war with Britain. So they were really they were demanding war with Britain. They had a battle cry of like free trade and sailors' rights, as you can see there, and they really were the convincing that people needed. And Madison on submitted a uh, submitted a war message to Congress on June 1st, 1812, and on June 18th, 1812, Congress approves and President Madison signs the declaration of war, which begins uh, the War of 1812, which would come to be known as a lot of different things. It came to be known as the Second American Revolution. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And also, those that were against the war called it Mr. Madison's War, like he was personally responsible for it. So it came to be known as a lot of different things. But anyway, so War of 1812, when it began, really poorly for the Americans. They were very poorly trained. We had more militia than professional soldiers. But on the flip side of that, you also had the British Army, which was very well trained, but they had been fighting France for almost a decade, and they were, this was really kind of a thorn in the side of the British because they were having to fight France in Europe, but also now they were having to fight the Americans in the United States. So um, neither side really was prepared for war when it broke out in 1812, and it went pretty poorly for the Americans right off the bat. They tried to invade Canada multiple times to take the territory that had been held by Britain there. It failed miserably. Um, there were again those conflicts with the Native Americans, and also the British Army was able to really invade from the north and the east. And they eventually, in August of 1814, they were able to take um, the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and they burned parts of the Capitol building, and what was called the Executive Mansion then is now called the White House. They burned parts of those buildings in retaliation for uh, the U.S. Army burning some British held forts and things like that a couple of years earlier. Um, but so that happened in August of 1812 of 1814, and then about a month later, sorry, let me go. So these are some paintings here depicting that, and then a month later, they began to invade Baltimore uh, through the port there. And one kind of interesting side note that happened here is um, a kind of failing musician named Francis Scott Key was evacuating the city of Baltimore while all this fighting was going on, and he happened to go by Fort McHenry, which was being bombarded by the British at the time, and he saw the American flag waving against the backdrop of all these bombs and things like that going off, and he was so inspired, he started jotting down a poem that would eventually come to be the Star Spangled Banner, which is our national anthem. So that's kind of one interesting little side note that happened. But as the war dragged on, a couple months after all this happened in Washington and Baltimore, it really kind of came to a head. The British weren't interested in fighting in the U.S. They this was a nuisance to them. They felt like they should be fighting the French in Europe, not the Americans in the United States. So they were really willing to end the war quickly. The U.S., things were going so poorly for them, they were willing to end the war as long as they didn't surrender. So both sides, because they really weren't interested in the war continuing more than it already had for these 2 years from 1812 to 1814. So in Christmas actually Christmas Eve of 1814, the United States and the British signed what's called the Treaty of Ghent, which ends the war. Um, but really, it just ends. It doesn't give either side really anything because both sides were so content with just ending the war. Um, that so they signed it in December of 1814. But then before any of that, before any of that information could get um, uh, down to the south, which is where some more British soldiers were trying to invade New Orleans. Andrew Jackson and the British troops, or excuse me, the American troops that he was commanding, fight the British at the Battle of New Orleans, and it's a huge defeat for the British. There's there's thousands of casualties for the British, and less than 50 for the Americans. I mean, it was just a complete, one-sided victory. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One, it created this national hero image of Andrew Jackson, which he would ride for years, all the way up until he becomes president in the late 1820s. And also, it felt like a final victory for the Americans. It felt like this was the battle that won them the War of 1812, even though they didn't win the war. The Treaty of Ghent didn't say that the Americans were the victors. It just ended the war, but this felt like it was a victory for the United States, and it created this swell of nationalism, um, which I'll get to more in just a minute. But also, the Treaty of Ghent, like I said, did not address any of the causes of the war. It didn't address free trade. It didn't address impressing of sailors. It literally ignored all of the causes that started the war. And it was really, it felt more like a placeholder than anything. It didn't end anything. It just ended. It didn't solve anything. So anyway, and then the effects of the 18 War of 1812, it created the sense of nationalism. Like I said, even though it made them feel like they beat the British again, even though technically they didn't. They just signed a treaty that ended the war. And then also, it created the beginning of what came to be known as the era of good feelings, which would go from the end of the War of 1812 into Monroe's presidency, which began in 1816. So we'll get into that starting now. So James Monroe takes over in 1816. He is elected to two terms, just like Jefferson and Madison before him. You can see here, he wins huge numbers of electoral votes in both elections, mostly because the Federalists fell out of power, which I'll get to in just a minute. But the Federalists, because of the Federalists falling out of favor with the American public, it created this dominance by the Democratic Republicans, which James Monroe was a Democratic Republican as well. So anyway, uh, so like I said, because the Federalists became so weak, um, the Democratic Republicans and Monroe were able to really do whatever they wanted. The reason the Federalists became so weak is because they had kind of plotted against uh, Madison and during the War of 1812. And once the word of that kind of got out, that they had been meeting in secret and trying to figure out a way to end the war without Madison's approval, it really created this image that they were anti-American, and it really kind of doomed them, and they really fell out of favor with the American public, and really eventually dissolved altogether. So Monroe, because they have all this power, because they have all this support behind them, they're able to promote this nationalism that was created by the War of 1812, and they did this through three ways. They did it through the government, they did it through the economy, and they did it through foreign affairs. So real quick with the government. Really, the only thing you need to know about that is that they were able to do it. Uh, the government was able to gain power through the Supreme Court, giving the federal government more power in these three cases here: Gibbons, Ogden, Cohen's, Virginia, Fletcher, Peck. Um, these court cases gave the national government more widespread power than they had prior to Monroe's presidency. And then also with the economy, they encouraged industry, they encouraged transportation, and they tried to link all three areas, Northwest and South, together. And I'll get more into that in just a minute. They tried to do it through something called the American system, which was a national unified economy. And like I said, I'll get into that more here in just a minute. Henry Clay, same Henry Clay that was a war hawk, uh, proposed this idea of what he called the American system. Also, a second bank was established, a second United States bank, which was eventually dissolved later on under Andrew Jackson. But it it was created to deal with the debts that were created during the War of 1812 because wars are expensive, as you know. And then also it created there was a tariff created to help protect the British or protect the Americans from imported British goods. And then they also tried to improve transportation through roads, canals, railroads, things like that. But back to the American system real quick. I'll just put these three things up. Let me move my avatar thing here. All right, so basically, Henry Clay established or proposed that these three very distinct economies, uh, cotton in the South, industry in the North, agriculture and grain in the West, he proposed that all three of them were linked through roads, canals, railroads, rivers, things like that, and they all worked intertwined to help promote this national system of economics. And it it made a lot of sense, and it helped our economy really start to boom and during this presidency, during the era of good feelings. But it was all made possible through railroads, canals, and the connectivity, the transportation that Monroe and other Democratic Republicans proposed during this time. Um, they also tried to expand the U.S.'s foreign policy power during this time. They expanded our borders. So after the War of 1812, you can see here, over a third of our population, uh, or after the War of 1812, people started flooding to the West, and then eventually by 1840, almost a third of our population is in this new territory. So they knew they had to help expand territory, but they also wanted to increase the role of the United States in foreign affairs, and they wanted them to have more power on the world stage. Um, so um, a couple of things happened in terms of increasing territory. 5 states were added to the Union. You can see there Indiana, then Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Louisiana. All those were added in a span of 7 years or so. Um, and then also national borders were changing. Uh, as you can see on this image here, this purple territory was given to the United States by Great Britain in 1818. Um, and we also came to an established border along the 49th parallel with Canada. So the top border of the United States that borders Canada was created through the 49th parallel. And then also in 1819, we signed a treaty with Spain called the Adams-Onis Treaty, which gave us territory in Mississippi, Alabama, and then also gave us the Florida territory, which had been held by Spain up to this point. Um, and it just continued to expand the borders of the U.S. And it also, in terms of a world stage, just real quick, you've probably heard of the Monroe Doctrine. Uh, the Monroe Doctrine was so basically a lot of these Latin American countries in Central and South America had been gaining independence from colonial powers like Spain and Portugal and things like that. So uh, as they gained independence, the U.S. wanted to support them, and they wanted to keep European countries from kind of not invading per se, but like poaching these areas in Central and South America. So Monroe came up with something that would eventually come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. And what that says was that any territory in the Western Hemisphere was protected from European interference by the United States. So basically, the U.S. was going to serve as a kind of police entity to the Western Hemisphere. And if a European country tried to establish rule in an area of Latin America, Central America, that the U.S. would offer assistance or try to stop it altogether. So the Monroe Doctrine came to be known as that. Um, And then, and last thing, real quick, and hopefully I'm under my 15, 20-minute time limit here. Hopefully, I don't have a running clock or anything, but hopefully it hasn't been too painful to this point. But the last thing is really the problem of slavery and sectionalism and what that led to. So you can't talk about American history without slavery, and really, after the U.S. became a free nation after the American Revolution, the problem of slavery was never really addressed, and it continued to grow. And you can see by this graphic here, 1790, which is kind of the, when we become this new independent nation, and 30 years later, during Monroe's presidency, you can see that slavery had not only has grown in size, but has also expanded westward. And so as these new territories were being added to the Union, it created very stark sectionalist attitudes. And what I mean by that is, like, you had kind of anti-slavery feelings in the North and pro-slavery feelings in the South, and that created a lot of problems as new territories were added, because if it was a free territory, then that meant that the senators that were sent to Congress from that territory were probably against slavery. But then you also had, if there was a slave state, then you probably had pro-slavery senators. So it was a problem. The idea of adding these new states became a thorn in the side of the American government. Um, and they disagreed over slavery. They disagreed over the role of slavery in the government and taxes and representation and things like that. And really, from 1820 to 1860, the disagreements over slavery dominated American politics, and it eventually came to a head at the Civil War, when really the slavery caused us to have a civil war. So anyway, but we'll get into that more in the future. So all this early tension over slavery really came to a head with the Missouri Compromise, which uh, happened when the Missouri Territory, as you can see here on the slide, the Missouri Territory applied to be a state in 1820, and it sparked this debate as to whether it should be a slave state or a free state, because as you can see, it's kind of in the middle of where there's the divide between pro and anti-slavery states. So when Missouri applied to be a state, it set off this huge debate over whether they should be slave or free. And if they had been a slave state, it created an imbalance in Congress. Up to this point, it had been balanced. Senators, there were the same number of pro-slavery senators as anti-slavery senators, but if Missouri joined just alone and became a slave state, which is what it was trying to be, then it would create an imbalance. So there had to be a compromise made. And Henry Clay, same Henry Clay as the American system and the Warhawks, and also who came to be known as the Great Compromiser in his career, if you know anything about him, he proposed what was eventually would become known as the Missouri Compromise. It was really called the Compromise of 1820 when it happened. But here's what happened. So Missouri was allowed to be a slave state, and then Maine, which had been a territory of Massachusetts up to this point, Maine broke away from Massachusetts and became its own state, and it would become a free state. So it made everybody, it kept everybody happy. It kept the balance between senators from slave states and free states. And that was the big thing. But then also the thing that it did is this green line right here in the image. As you can see, the 3630 parallel. This was established as the line of slavery, slave states and free states in all Western territory. So if you look at let me see if I can draw on here real quick. So if you look at, so basically everything, this line here, that's created here, this 3630 line, if it extends out, and I know I'm doing a terrible job of drawing it here, but anything above this in the Western Territory would have to be a free state, and then anything below it was able to be a slave state if they expanded westward. And that at the time made everybody happy, but as you can probably imagine, it didn't last. And yeah, so that's the main points of the Missouri Compromise. So that's it. Hopefully that wasn't too painful for everybody involved. But I don't know if I said this, but feel free to reach out to your teachers. If not, something in here didn't make sense, I apologize. Feel free to reach out to your teachers, Mr. Black or Ms. Bazinski, if they're your teachers. Obviously, if you're one of my students and something doesn't make sense, please reach out and over reminder email during office hours during this whole remote learning process, and we'll do our best to answer it. And I look forward to seeing you guys, quote unquote, seeing you guys again when my next video rolls around. Mr. Black, like I said, will handle the next video about Andrew Jackson next week. And yeah, that's it for me. So thanks, guys. Later.